सबसे पहले मैं आमंत्रित कर रहा हूँ, आज जैसा आप जानते हैं हम सारे लोग यहाँ रामा भीमा सोमा इस किताब के लोकार्पण, इसके जारी करने के मौके पर हैं और इस मौके पर एक चर्चा में भी शामिल होने के लिए हम यहाँ इकट्ठा हुए हैं। और हमारे लिए खुशनसीबी की बात है कि लेखक मौजूद हैं, श्रीकर राघवन। मैं सबसे पहले उनसे अनुरोध करता हूँ कि वे आएँ, और नेहा दीक्षित, राजीव गौड़ा। श्रीकर राघवन किताब के लेखक हैं और मुझे जहाँ तक पता है ये उनकी पहली किताब है।
हाँ।
और किताबें लिखने का इरादा रखते हैं, और आप किताब को देखकर भी अंदाज कर सकते हैं कि इसकी पूरी संभावना या कुछ लोगों के लिए आशंका हो सकती है कि किताबें आएंगी और इसी तरह पुख्ता किताबें होंगी। श्रीकर कर्नाटक में रहते हैं। इस किताब के बारे में मैं अभी बहुत कुछ नहीं कहने जा रहा हूँ परिचय में, क्योंकि वो बातचीत के दौरान निकलेगा। जब अमृता ने मुझे यह किताब भेजी और इस किताब के बारे में बात की और मैंने किताब पढ़ना शुरू किया, तो मैं बहुत ज़्यादा उत्तेजना से भर गया, क्योंकि किसी एक इलाके की, किसी एक राज्य की का सांस्कृतिक इतिहास इस प्रकार लिखा जा सकता है, इसका अनुमान मैं नहीं कर सकता था। ये कर्नाटक का एक प्रकार का सांस्कृतिक इतिहास है, जो इस किताब के उपशीर्षक में भी लिखा हुआ है, कल्चरल इन्वेस्टिगेशंस इनटू मॉडर्न कर्नाटका। लेकिन कल्चर भी एक बहुत व्यापक शब्द है, जिसमें राजनीति भी है, जिसमें सामाजिक आंदोलन भी हैं, जिसमें पूरी ज़िंदगी है। तो और श्रीकर ने इसे बहुत दिलचस्प तरीके से किया है, जिसमें बहुत सारी शख्सियतें आएंगी जिनको ज़्यादा करीब से राजीव जानते होंगे, जिनके बारे में। लेकिन जैसा खुद श्रीकर कह रहे थे कि यह दरअसल मुख्य रूप से 3 दशकों का इतिहास है, जैसा वह कह रहे हैं 70, 80 और 90 के दशक का, लेकिन प्राय तकरीबन, लेकिन ये उसके आगे और पीछे भी जाता है। तो हम तरीका बातचीत का ये रखेंगे कि मैं सबसे पहले श्रीकर से ये जानना चाहूँगा कि इस किताब का ख्याल उनके दिमाग में कैसे आया और फिर किताब बनी कैसे।
This book basically started when I was in my second year of my masters. I was doing a MA in English in Manipal, but we were taking very diverse courses in sociology, in history, in philosophy, in literature. And one of the things that set apart my college was the emphasis on Indian literatures, on regional literatures. So even if we were studying English, they encourage us to read in our mother tongues. And तो मैं तब तक एक कन्नड़ा नॉवल भी नहीं पढ़ा था, और I wanted to explore that, and that's when I started reading more Kannada, and I discovered there's this entire new world that nobody's really written about in English. And but the real jump start to this book was when I encountered this Maoist revolutionary from Mysore called Saket Rajan. So he was shot dead in 2005 in the Western Ghats. There was an Naxalite insurrection there. There was also an environmentalist movement there. There was a movement against the creation of a national park which would evict the local Adivasis. So all of these came together at that point. But what fascinated me about Saket Rajan was that we were both from Mysore. We were both from an upper caste family, privileged upbringing, trying to reckon with that. He also gets into science, then quits that, goes off to journalism. He comes to Delhi, IAMC, where he wins like 4 gold medals. And even I, went into engineering, quit that, then came to humanities. He used to play the mandolin, apparently, and so did I. And so I became fascinated with this man, and he left behind 2 thick volumes of a Marxist history of Karnataka, very dense, very problematic also in many ways, not easy to read, not easy to review. I discovered in him this blinding singularity of purpose, where he's not really ready to acknowledge any contestation and embarks on this very idealistic, quixotic path. And so I started reading more about him. I started reading those works, and I got a glimpse of the 70s, the urgency and intense idealism of the 70s, the post 1968 moment in the world. And I discovered an enormous array of social movements, which we might broadly call left movements. There were farmers' movement, there was a very powerful Dalit movement, environmental movements. There were socialists who very much defined themselves in opposition to the extremities of the left that someone like Sakit Rajan would go on to represent. So it's a very colourful, mixed bag. And what was more important was there were Kannada writers who were reflecting on these developments with great passion and involvement. And it felt like a very special moment in history that I really wanted to try and discover or rediscover. And I thought it would help us understand how we reached here in our present political moment. So that was the seed of the book. And I wrote one half-baked thesis about Sakit Rajan's work and all of that. But it was during the pandemic that I applied to the New India Foundation, and I had a project, a history of social movements in Karnataka, and I was a literary student, so I proposed a book that relied more on all sorts of literary sources, whether it's novels, whether it's poetry, whether it's autobiographies, and so they liked it, and I got the fellowship the next year. So uske baad, I went to Manipal. I started reading all sorts of Kannada books. I wanted to interview people who had lived through these decades. So I interview a lot of activists and writers. A lot of them were old people. So I think 70% of the book is me meeting old people. And their recollections of this past and how their own worldviews had changed over the last few decades. And the feeling I got was, at least with the activists I meant, was they were holding on to this form of idealism, as outdated as it might be, but they were still saying in our moment, there might be all this hate and bigotry going on, but it's not going to be through me. And I found that very moving. And so that is one thread that runs through this book.
So, Rajeev.
Congratulations, Srikar.
Thank you.
Quite an effort. And I want to take two angles. You can do them one at a time if you like. One, for me, this was a fantastic introduction to a world that I had somewhat missed out on. I left for the US when I was 20 years old in 1984. So a huge portion of what you're writing about, I only returned in 2000. So I'm sort of from far away. I come across people. Many of the people you mention here are friends of mine. The late Ananthamurthy, the late Gauri Lankesh, people like that, close friends, in fact. And so it was interesting to see what they would have told me along the way here and there, to hear the history and the context in much more detail. So what this book does, frankly, is because Srikar is gone and spoken to people who were part of these movements when they were happening, when they were part of these disputes and debates when they were coming alive, when they were evolving, he is able to give a context and a connect to today's generation, to a world which was very different. उस समय ये लोग जो है इस पुस्तक में वो सब आदर्शवादी. So it's good you stopped in the 90s. उसके बाद आदर्श क्या है? What is an ideal? Who is an idealist? The same socialists that or who are the descendants of the leaders you mentioned here, turned out to junk their idealism and become amongst the most corrupt Karnataka politicians you would ever see. Okay, so these sorts of dilemmas are what we are dealing with in the last 25, 30 years, probably where your book ends and current history begins. So it's very, very, so just going back, you've done a marvelous service to us, especially those of us who are not particularly bilingual. So, मेरे जैसे लोग, we are more global than local. Okay. And अगर मैं बेंगलुरु में हिंदी में बात करता हूँ तो लोग मुझको पूछेंगे क्या कर रहे हो भाई? And that will become an issue. That Purvarji talked about how contentious the language issue is. But what happens is that we grow up with a limited span of attention, right? And so we read mostly works in English. And so we are missing out on a lot of what, of Kannada. So I'm curious, how, for someone who didn't read Kannada novels, etc., along the way, how long did it take? How much effort did it take to not just read, but to master the nuances and get a sense of everything else that, that comes together?
Right. I mean, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying I've mastered anything. Especially, I recognized a lot of my limitations when I'm trying to translate poetry, for instance. I read the poet Bendre, for instance. Very difficult to translate, I don't even attempt it. But it was a painstaking process because I'd just learned the Kannada alphabet when I was in first standard. I was in Mysore for 1 year. I studied in a state board school, so I knew a little bit of Kannada. But for the longest time, I'd never read a book. And so I started with the dictionary in hand, in the left hand, and the book in the right hand, and trying to, match every word. The internet helps. They're very good. There's good online dictionaries. I would often call up my grandma, ask her to, translate some stuff. And so I had help, but it was a very painstaking process. And but interestingly, I felt more at home with Kannada non-fiction than fiction in the beginning, because for some reason it felt much more understandable, much more relatable, maybe because I'd been reading so much non-fiction in English at that point. So Kannada fiction surprisingly turned out to be a bit of a tougher nut to crack than non-fiction. And so that I took my time with. And I relied on translations when they were good ones, but they're not always good ones. And certain writers, for instance, like Chandrasekhar Kambar or Shankar Mokashi Punekar or even Anantmurti, they had a very unique Kannada style. And so it took me a while to get used to that. But of course, there was also a genre of very dense, reflexive non-fiction, like the kind of stuff D.R. Nagaraj is writing, for instance. That again stymied me, so I had to reread, make notes. And it definitely got easier over the 3-4 years that I spent on this book. And now I think I can say I'm fairly comfortable with Kannada. I can read it as I'm nodding off or when I'm not full of energy. So it's I can read for pleasure. That's a nice development.
Neha.
So Srikar, thank you for writing this book. Also because you said you got the fellowship and then you wrote the book, which is the case for a lot of us. You get the fellowship, then you have to finish it. So that's good. Recently, we had this fellowship retreat and everybody was calling Srikar a polymath, so which was fantastic because of the book.
One person might have.
But I do want to say that in the times that we are living in, I mean, I was still to finish the Srikar's book, the times that we are living in, for example, पिछले जैसे अभी 2014 के बाद से बातचीत हो रही है कि मेजॉरिटेरियनिज्म है, बहुत सारा सरकार का और जो पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज पावर में है वो किस तरीके से सब चीज़ों को दबा रही हैं, बहुत ज़्यादा रेजिस्टेंस भी हो रहा है, मगर एक डिप्रेशन टाइप का भी बैठ जाता है कि अरे अब क्या होगा, एक हताशा बैठ जाती है. बट एक्चुअली आई एम जस्ट going to bring that parallel with what Srikar has done, because it's a great inspiration to sort of record what is happening. Like पिछले 10 सालों में ठीक है सरकार आई और इस तरीके का लोगों पे दमन हो रहा है, मगर उसके बावजूद हमें ये देखना ज़रूरी है कि एक लगातार लोग भी चुप नहीं बैठे हैं. अवार्ड वापसी भी हो रहा है, नॉट इन माई नेम भी हो रहा है, फार्मर्स प्रोटेस्ट भी हो रहा है, शाहीन बाग भी हो रहा है. तो इस तरीके की बहुत सारी चीज़ें लोग लगातार कर रहे हैं. और मेरे ख्याल से जब जिस तरीके से श्रीकर ने लिखा है 70s, 80s, 90s कर्नाटका के बारे में, हम लोग जिस वक्त में रह रहे हैं, जब इसको डॉक्यूमेंट किया जाएगा तो वो भी इसी तरीके से डॉक्यूमेंट किया जाएगा. और बहुत ज़्यादा, क्योंकि इनकी किताब इज ऑलमोस्ट लाइक अ ट्रैवलॉग टेकिंग यू थ्रू ऑल द सोशल मूवमेंट्स, कल्चरल मूवमेंट्स एंड व्हाटएवर इज हैपनिंग ऑन द ग्राउंड. इट इज़ एब्सोल्युटली एसेंशियल टू रिमेंबर कि अभी भी के वक्त जो एक प्रोपेगेंडा चल रहा है, स्पेशली नॉट जस्ट लाइक कल्चरली बट ऑल्सो एक इरेजर हो रहा है पब्लिक डिस्कोर्स से कि क्या लोग क्या कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि इतना थका दिया जा रहा है, लोगों को जेल में डाल दिया जा रहा है, फिर एक नया मूवमेंट हो रहा है, फिर से कोई फार्म लॉ आ गए, फिर से एक नया मूवमेंट हो रहा है. तो एक पब्लिक मेमोरी से जो इरेजर हो रहा है लोगों के स्ट्रगल्स का, उस चीज़ को किस तरीके से डॉक्यूमेंट किया जाएगा जब साथ साथ प्रोपेगेंडा भी चल रहा है. क्योंकि प्रोपेगेंडा इस वक्त इस तरीके से पहुंचा है कि इट्स लिटरली लाइक पोस्ट ट्रूथ वर्ल्ड, जिसे कहते हैं कि आप दिखाते रहिए, आप एविडेंस दिखाते रहिए, आप कागज दिखाते रहिए, मगर उससे कोई भी जो लोग हैं जो उस प्रोपेगेंडा से प्रभावित है उन पे कोई असर नहीं हो रहा है. एंड सो देयर कम्स इमोशन, because propaganda can no longer be dealt with evidence or facts. Propaganda can only be dealt with emotions, and in that space, what does a cultural movement do is something that we need to look at. So the films that are coming, the films that are being shown, और ज़मीन के जगह पे भी अगर आप देखें, जो एक जैसे हम लोग फिल्मों को बहुत बुरा मानते हैं, मगर मतलब कहते हैं ये क्या बेकार सी फिल्म है, आदमी लड़े और औरतें लड़ रही है, बॉलीवुड फिल्मों में भी. मगर एक वक्त होता था जब छोटे छोटे जगहों में सिनेमाघर होते थे जहाँ लोग जाके देख सकते थे. बट नाउ विद द मल्टीप्लेक्सेस इवन दैट इज अनअफोर्डेबल. सो व्हाट इज द काइंड ऑफ कल्चरल इंटरवेंशन दैट वी हैव ऑन द ग्राउंड, जो एक प्रोग्रेसिव नेचर का हो, जहाँ पे बहुत तरीके की बातचीत हो. So in that context, Srikar, your book is absolutely important. So I want to ask you if there is anything, while working on the film, you can see any parallels with what is happening right now in the country that we are living in.
Perhaps more than a parallel, there might be one story that sort of helps us understand how we segued into this. So there is this institution in Kolar called AIDEM. It was started by the activist, poet and playwright Kotkanhalli Ramaya, who was very active in the Dalit movement, in the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti in the 70s and 80s. So they start this institution in the early 2000s because he felt there needed to be a new kind of cultural movement, a new kind of cultural revolution that had to come through an engagement with children, trying to experiment with children's theatre, a new kind of formative education that breaks out of these very disciplinary education models that we have. And so this institution comes up in the early 2000s. They have these plays performed by children. They have a fest every month attracting all the locals. And the trajectory of this institution itself from say 2012 to 2020, which coincides with the arrival of social media. And so a lot of the Kotkanhalli Ramaya himself dissociates from this movement, and a lot of people I spoke to, I asked them, why do you think a space like this is so vibrant? It somehow gets diluted, and they said, look, once you have these new media, children have, or teenagers have new ways of connecting, new ways of networking. So suddenly you have to rethink the whole model. What is the space for a movement like this or a cultural movement like this in today's world? So I did encounter a lot of befuddlement. How do you respond to this? What are these new cultural movements? Even this sort of a Gandhian democratic non-violent movement, that too seems to have diminished in effectiveness, right? Sonam Wangchuk does a 21-day fast in Ladakh and nobody really cares. So I think we are at a point where the state is trying to make it as difficult and unpleasant as possible for anybody to come out on the streets and actively protest. And one of my interviewees recalled with nostalgia saying, we used to do so many jail bharo campaigns in the 1980s. At one point, there's some 30,000 farmers in Karnataka prisons or something like that. And he said, now if you even go see an inside of a cell, suddenly it's over. Everyone thinks you're an anti-national or whatever. So the atmosphere has changed so much. I wouldn't jump to drawing parallels at all. I think it's a very new phenomenon. It's a modern, authoritarian state asserting itself. And I think we need to rethink. And this is what a lot of the activists, including Kodvanalli Ramaya, told me, is we need to find new media. We need to find new medium. The old methods don't work anymore. We need to reinvent, make a new leap of invention.
श्रीकर, राजीव कह रहे थे कि ये ठीक ही हुआ कि तकरीबन 90 तक ये किताब है, क्योंकि एक आदर्शों की दुनिया थी और अब पता नहीं है कि आदर्श क्या है. आपने भी एक शब्द का इस्तेमाल किया, नॉस्टैल्जिया. तो अगर ये सवाल किया जाए कि क्या ये किताब आदर्श के नॉस्टैल्जिया की किताब है, उसको याद करने की किताब है और उसके खो जाने की किताब है, क्योंकि और क्या ये किताब एक दुनिया के खो जाने की किताब है, एक दुनिया जो थी और अब नहीं है, और उसको वापस हासिल किया जा सकता है कि नहीं हासिल किया जा सकता है. आप किस तरह इसको देखते हैं?
मतलब एक रिव्यू आया था किताब का ओपन मैगजीन में, मैं लिखा था, दिस बुक इज नॉट एन एक्ट ऑफ कल्चरल नॉस्टैल्जिया. एंड both yes and no. There is a kind of nostalgia in terms of this idealism, Yadarsh, and by the time of the early 2000s, you're already seeing a sort of reaching out for this lost idealism. You're trying to see how these might play out. But I'm actually quite critical of a lot of the people I meet, the movements I'm trying to talk about, especially because you had these very idealistic movements, all of these, whether it is the farmers or the Dalits or whoever, but there is this corruption of patriarchy and casteism and hierarchy. Even so, they do creep into these movements. Corruption, as Rajeev was saying, by the time of the 90s, you had a lost idealism. And so I do try to excavate what is worthwhile about this. For instance, I'm quite sympathetic to the Lohiite socialists of the 50s and 60s. There's Gopal Gowda, Shantaveri, and the associated literary figures, whether it is Anantamurthy, Lankesh, Kuvempu to a certain extent. So these guys, they abhorred financial greed. They knew that the primary enemies to be fought were casteism and patriarchy in rural India. They wanted to use literature as this way of reckoning with the ethical realities of politics. And so there are certain values that I look nostalgically upon, but I do look at most of it with a critical eye, I think.
मैं आपसे भी ये जानना चाहता हूँ राजीव, यू कैन टेक दिस माइक्रोफोन। श्रीकर सामाजिक आंदोलनों की बात करते हैं और उन्होंने कहा कि लोहियावादी असर करना, और कर्नाटक इस लिहाज से बहुत दिलचस्प है कर्नाटक का कि जो लोहियावादी समाजवाद है, अगर दक्षिण में सबसे ज़्यादा मजबूत कहीं दिखलाई पड़ता है तो वो कर्नाटक में दिखलाई पड़ता है, और कर्नाटक ही वो जगह बनती है या वो दरवाज़ा बनता है जिससे हिंदुत्व दक्षिण में प्रवेश करता है। इन दोनों चीज़ों को हम कैसे समझें? मैंने यू आर अनंत मूर्ति से कई बार ये पूछा कि लोहिया को लेकर ये जो आपका फैसिनेशन था आप सारे लोगों का, उसके बारे में आपने कभी क्रिटिकली सोचा या नहीं सोचा कि लोहियावाद ने या लोहियावादी समाजवाद ने भारतीय राजनीति के साथ क्या किया? तो एक राजनेता के तौर आपसे भी मैं पूछूंगा और आपसे भी ये सवाल होगा, लेकिन एक राजनेता के तौर पर आप क्या सोचते हैं?
एक सवाल ऐड कर सकती
प्लीज।
हूँ। वो ये कि जैसे लोहिया हिंदी नेशनलिज्म में भी बिलीव करते थे, तो वो कर्नाटका में उस तरीके में उनका क्या?
बिल्कुल।
Lohiya's influence was spectacular but limited in certain regions of Malnad, for example. The socialist movement broadly, the Praja Socialist Party was the leading opposition party for a long time. But what is otherwise called the Samyukta Socialist Party, the Lohiaite group, actually had very few but very spectacular successes. Two of them later became chief ministers of mainstream parties, Bangarappa and J.H. Patel.
Yeah.
All right. So in the, even our Siddaramaiah is fundamentally from the same socialist tradition. But since a lot of them ultimately joined either the Congress or the Janata and left those ideals behind in pursuit of political power, to some extent that draw sort of fell by the wayside. The inspiration, the commitment to transformation, etc. So in some, the Gowda Satyagraha and all those that people still talk about is in the 50s. Yeah. It's a really long time ago in terms of modern history, right? But going to the other issue, इसी जगह में हिंदुत्व कैसे पैदा हुआ, right? So what is going on in larger society? See, for example, in Karnataka, the same districts, say Dakshina Kannada and Udupi now, where land reforms under Devarajars were at its best and really empowered tenant farmers and got rid of absentee landlords and others, etc. Those same people who were empowered somehow became enamored of the older traditions, and they became the foot soldiers of Hindutva violence. Okay, so you will see that the upper caste elites, behind Hindutva movements are behind. It is the emancipated lower caste who actually go out there and kill other religions and one another. All right, they become cannon fodder for the movement. But there again, I think it's also because if people are looking for some ideal to motivate them, if you're looking for, so where are you going to get that? Are you going to get that from the political leadership that's offering you, a sort of a inclusive growth story? Or are you getting it from people who are promoting resentment? So one of the triggers of Hindutva, resurgence is Baba Budangiri, right? This is a hill in Chikmagalur, and you cover this, right? Yeah. So the pattern has been wherever you find syncretic practices, Hindus and Muslims worshipping together, whether it is the Goshala in Dhar or something like that. There's one place in Madhya Pradesh, maybe I say, all right. So there are many such instances. So the Hindutva approach is, you see syncretism, you see people coming together, well, let's break that and create enough tension in the process that hatred dominates. For the first time since all that happened in Chikmagalur, basically the grave of an Arab saint called Baba Budan, who amongst other things brought coffee from Arabia to India, it shares the same space as the temple of Dattatreya, who is a formless god. Okay, so it's a Hindu and Muslim worship, place of worship. But some of the people who became very successful politically used this to say, no, this should be entirely with the Hindus. Let's oust the other. There's all kinds of mischief along the way. But then you have your Shobha Yatras, you have the hills turning saffron, and they will reap political benefits, forever. This time in 2023, by narrow margins, the Congress swept the entire Chikmagalur district and Kodagu for that matter. Okay, these are all regions which have been very, very saffronized. Okay, so part of it is, what are you offering that is different to the youth, to people who are looking for ideals to motivate you? If it is, if you in the 2000s, after 2004, when the earlier useless iron ore in Bellary became extremely valuable, you suddenly saw the emergence of the Reddy brothers, who suddenly said, okay, we've got thousands of crores, let's take over the state. And then you start to see, Yediyurappa, if you were to ask him, he'll tell you that he ended up becoming super, I shouldn't be being recorded, but basically in order to get resources to counter these guys who were just awash in wealth. And this is also the period after which politicians start buying votes, right? You're no longer just giving out liquor before the election. Now you're paying voters. And, at least in the Lok Sabha, I contested the Lok Sabha recently, we don't have voter demands for cash. At the assembly level, they will come to you and say, how much are you giving me? And in the afternoon, they go to the other party, in the evening to the third party. And it's just, the whole system is rotten. Yeah. So that is, it's not a very inspiring environment. So what do you say? Did you get a sense of it?
Just about Baba Budangiri. Incidentally, it's not Baba Budan's grave, I think. It's just, so Dattatreya is this Puranic Hindu deity. Over the course of centuries, he comes to be synonymously worshipped with Dada Hayat Kalandar. This is in Sufi myth, so he's supposed to be a companion of the Prophet, and so on. And I think a more interesting contrast of the polarization of the Malnad, rather than the socialists of the 50s and 60s, I think there might be a more immediate contrast, more worthwhile contrast to be made with the Naxal insurrection with Sakit Rajan. And so I quote in my book one of the academic Muzaffar Asadi, who passed away recently. So he noted in 2004 that it is this left-wing adventurism that gave the right a sort of easy way to denounce all other progressive movements happening in the region as Naxalite. So it just became an easy labeling. And that contributed in a great way to the rise of the right wing as well. And also, Dakshin Kannada would be, there is this very interesting, unique cultural ethos, what with the Udupi Matha and all sorts of, cultural traditions, whether it's Yakshagana or Bhudakola. So this also gives this politics a veneer of legitimacy. I think it's happening here. It's always been vibrant. So it's a very complicated scene. And I have a chapter called The Aesthetic Universals of South Canara, where I try to talk about this shorn of the politics. So in the hope that it might help us understand something about the uniqueness of that place, and politics, I keep it to another chapter.
Well, if I may interrupt, just for them to connect, the movie Kantara and the rituals, which are essentially not non-Sanskritic rituals, which are now actually being claimed by Hindutva adherents.
Yeah.
So that's the complication.
But it is true that the land reforms also contributed to this. For instance, so the Billava community, who a lot of them are foot soldiers of the right, organizations like Bajrang Dal and Sri Ram Seni and so on. So they benefited from the land reforms of the 1970s. So earlier landlords were like Brahmins and Jains and so on, but the Billavas become a landed community. And interestingly, the Billavas gain access to institutionalized religion only in the early 20th century, when Narayan Guru builds temples in South. So more than Ambedkar, Narayan Guru is a very big figure in South Canara. And one interesting anecdote I heard was that, so in the wake of this land reforms, this newly landed community, instead of investing in health and education, they went back to this cultural pride, like you said. And there was an instance of a Billava community tearing down a hostel to build a shrine. I thought it was very telling. And with regard to Neha's question about Lohia's Hindi, so I mean the inspiration that the Kannada literati drew from Lohia was precisely the fact that he's telling them to talk in regional languages. Ananthamurthy decides to write in Kannada because of his Lohiite leaning. So I think Lohia
You wanted to impose Hindi all over the country.
Not really. I don't think it's that simplistic at all.
No.
He was in favor of empowering vernacular languages wherever they might be, and it is testament to that I found so many translations of Lohia in Kannada.
Yeah.
Well, there exists practically very little of it in English. So I read Lohia in Kannada rather than English. So I came to know of Lohia through his Kannada translations, which were often done by very eminent literati like K.V. Subbanna and so on. And all the leading literary figures emphasized Lohia's contribution to their own politics. And so yeah, he came up to me as a very singular figure. And of course, there are very valid critiques of Lohia. He sometimes tended to be a misogynist, very loose comments he makes and so on. But in the broader legacy, he came to me as a very clean figure, I felt.
Easy.
नहीं, मैं ये चाह रहा था श्रीकर कि आप हमें ये बतलाएं जो राजीव ने इसके बारे में थोड़ी बात की, वो ये है कि कर्नाटका आखिर वह दरवाज़ा कैसे बना जिससे हिंदुत्व का प्रवेश हुआ दक्षिण भारत में. हाउ डिड इट एंटर? सो ये सवाल आपके सामने था या नहीं था?
अभी भी आरएसएस के कितने प्रचारक हैं कर्नाटका से? बहुत सारे हैं. दत्तात्रेय, होसबाले. The RSS influence, especially after the emergency, it increases. And there's a personal valence to me here also, because I heard a lot about this from my grandfather. And so in the 70s, during the opposition to the emergency, the RSS gains a legitimacy, and I found old RSS pamphlets from like the 60s, for instance. Golwarkar 67 mein Karnataka ko aata hai, and then I found a pamphlet where it's a usual talking points is cow protection, vilification of minorities and so on. But then by the mid 70s you have freedom of expression and freedom of dissent and this sort of theme. And I think it was, again, this has been spoken about and researched in English scholarship quite a bit as well. So it is that moment that gives them a sort of fillip. And there is quite a bit of RSS influence in like Mysore, for instance. You go to a hospital and then you'll find pamphlets on Savarkar and Golwalkar. So it has been steadily growing. As to why, it has many reasons, many complicated reasons that I think would derail our conversation by way too much.
In defense of my state and my people, we are not as communal as the entry and success of the BJP in our state might suggest. For the longest time, it was the Congress, and then the Congress split with the Janata emerging, and it was these two parties that dominated. And when, in 2006, Kumaraswamy broke the Janata, ousted all the senior leaders, and the party split into those who decided to stay with Devegowda and those who opposed him. Those who opposed him all went and joined the BJP. So from nowhere, the BJP suddenly had a huge mass of political leaders without RSS roots or loyalties. But they are all people who will just keep their mouth shut or shout the right slogans now because they have to listen to Nagpur or Keshav Krupa in Bangalore or wherever. So it's actually not, as communal, but it's slowly getting there, I think. May I ask a question? Yeah. So here, one of the nice things for me is that all these literary movements, Navodaya, Navya, Bandaya, all of those, you are able to sort of give us a humanized perspective on those. But in the course of doing all this, what's going on nowadays? Is literary engagement and creativity as active as before? Are we all living on past glory? Kannada has the highest number of Jnanpith awards, all that sort of thing. And can you give us a sense of what's going on? The only thing I see is who gets elected as Kannada Sahitya Parishad chairman, as president or something.
Yeah, so there is wonderful Kannada writing, Kannada theatre, Kannada films, not so much maybe, but theatre especially I think is a very thriving, performing arts scene, and there are of course new forms of identitarian movements. There is queer literature in Kannada, and there is so what I got, the broader feeling I got was there is a much more niche island-like culture right now. Not everyone is reading everybody else. That discursive world where Lankesh writes a short story and then Anant Murthy has to comment on it. That kind of a culture is not really there because there are these different islands. And so at that New India Foundation retreat, we had Vasudendra on one of the panels, and he made a very interesting comment. He said, look, if you have an English panel, and nobody cares what your caste is or whether you're LGBTQ or whatever, you're all speaking from a position of equality. But if you have a Kannada panel, then suddenly people are very aware, is this a Brahmin? Is this an OBC? What is the real scene? And someone in the audience stood up and said, this is not just true to Kannada, it's also there in Marathi, in other regional languages, because there is this sense of finally gaining access to this world of letters, and you're conscious of these histories, and so this comes over. So this I think in summation is a good way to see what is happening in the Kannada world.
Neha, do you have any question? मैं ये भी जानना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि अभी बातचीत में जहाँ हम पहुँचे हैं वहाँ जाति का सवाल या कास्ट, तो क्या अब बातचीत की जो बुनियादी इकाई है वो आखिरकार कास्ट है? अगर मैं हिंदुत्व को छोड़ दूँ तो क्या समाज को समझने की, कर्नाटका को समझने की या उसके बारे में बात करने की आखिरी या पहली इकाई यूनिट अब कास्ट है, और वो कास्ट कॉन्शियसनेस किस तरह की है? मैं इसमें ये भी जोड़ दूं कि क्या कर्नाटका में भी एनहाइलेशन ऑफ कास्ट एक परमानेंटली पोस्टपोन पोजीशन है या वो कहीं है होराइजन में?
Yeah. So one of the things I discovered is a lot of the Dalit activists I spoke to, they were bemoaning the fact that Ambedkar has not really been understood properly by the current activists and political personages. They felt that his universalism was in some sense lost. And I had an interesting conversation with Arvind Malagatti, who Mysore mein hai. He's a researcher, scholar, activist, Buddhist. And we were talking about Dalit literature. And he had a very famous falling out with the Bandaya. So Bandaya is this progressive literary movement in the late 70s that is, trying to challenge elite domination, and it is this broad umbrella of progressivism where they're trying to include minorities, women, everybody who hadn't been encouraged by the Kannada world adequately before. And Arvind Malagatti has a fight with the progressives of the Bandaya. So they say Dalit literature is part of this. Bandaya ka ek hissa hai wo. And he says no, that is not the right way to approach it. And he says there are a lot of writers who would say only Dalits can produce Dalit literature. And he begged to differ. He said, if Shivaram Karant or Kuvempu writes about Dalits, that is also exceptional Dalit literature. And so I felt that there was a political/cultural argument to be made. There's a political argument to say, no, this is our identity, and this is by definition not extended to everybody. It can only be experienced and articulated by those who have experienced untouchability. But there's a broader cultural argument that that could break away from these caste boundaries completely. You could make a broader anti-caste statement rather than an anti-Brahmin statement. And this is what Arvind Malagatti was, I think, trying to tell me, that in this process of subsuming this identity, making it a part of something, you're again subscribing to the exclusionary mechanism that's gone on for centuries. You're saying, nahi, yehi hai, yehi kar sakte hain, only this sort of subaltern experience can give rise to these literatures, to these cultural expressions. And what he was trying to say is we need to break out of that completely. Otherwise, what's the point? And he was kicked out of the organization for saying this. He said they thought I was just trying to rankle the progressives. But there was another quote I heard from, again, Kotiganhalli Ramaya. So he remembers going to this meeting in 1973. There was this famous conference called Dalekayusm, which is a conclave of young writers and artists, where the novelist Devanur Mahadeva makes a speech. He says, what I've written amounts to maybe a hand or a few fingers, but imagine if the whole body could speak for itself. And there was an interesting parallel to this when I was reading Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, where he's arguing for this pan-Africanism rather than mere national identities. So only this kind of a totality could speak to or speak against colonialism. And I think there's a similar argument to be made in the Indian context as well. So the annihilation of caste can only come about when these intercaste rivalries end, right? And at some point, if not politically, at least culturally, you can start making a case for this universalism of a way of dissolving these boundaries so that they become categories that ultimately have very little meaning or resonance.
I'll just finish this off 1 second. So caste is very much rewarded politically. And, tickets are distributed, votes are gathered in the name of caste, so it's still very much alive. But there's one point that he mentions in passing, which is the mathas, right? So every caste and subcaste now has their own religious institution, religious order, and the aim is to use that as a platform to get the engineering college and the medical college and educate the people from those communities. And so those have become institutions which have a political role, which have a mobilization role, and so really there's no sign of caste disappearing or getting annihilated in any historic sense. Yeah, in any foreseeable future, it's very much alive. Yeah, and I'm the only non-Brahmin on this panel. Dominant caste, OBC, creamy layer, whatever, but nonetheless.
We're running out of time, is it?
No,
okay,
please.
One quick question. Srikar, would you like to tell us why you've named the book this and what have people interpreted
Yes.
So yeah, for all of you who are wondering what the hell Rama Bhima Soma is, it's a game. हम लोग स्कूल में खेलते थे, बच्चे खेलते थे. You have all you need is a ball. You throw the ball high up in the air, and once it comes down, you count off each pitch as Rama Bhima Soma. तीन बार pitch होने के लिए wait करते हैं. And then whoever is near the ball picks it up and you start hitting each other, bashing each other. Very violent game. And we loved it. We played it every opportunity we got. And I found in the game a metaphor for democracy because power is always alternating between the self and the other. You're identifying with yourself and then with the broader mass. I think the game it's a pan-Indian game apparently. Some of you here might have played it, known it by a different name. Somewhere it's called Kings, which is appropriate because you're briefly king for a while and then someone else is. You play exactly. So there is this kind of native wisdom sort of vibe that goes with the game, and despite all of these, political developments, there's some kind of a hope that a game like this has survived, and I use it as a metaphor that opens the book so that I can lay out a broader theme of interconnections of players playing with each other, because ultimately humans are mutual creations. We learn from each other, we respond to each other, and that's true of writers, politicians, anybody. Ideas play with each other. Cultures play with each other. I have a chapter called Marga Desi and the Battle of Identities, where again this Marga Desi is a broader metaphor resonant in other Indian literatures as well. The metaphor, and you mentioned squabbles. The Kannada world was full of all sorts of squabbles, but they were always well meant in service of a larger, ethos, and that the game captured that quite brilliantly. So that's one more reason.
And how were they interpreting the name you used?
Yeah, a lot of people are befuddled. Like, okay, I can understand Rama and Bhima, political keywords right now. What is this Soma? And to one, I had a cheeky response. I said, Soma is social media. In some sense, it's appropriate. Soma is this mythical drug, and you have this everyone going for the dopamine fix every minute.
It's also Shiva.
It's also Shiva, yeah. But again, this is a common phraseology. I think there's a Kannada movie called Rama Bhima Soma, but it's just this punchy. It's like Tom, Dick, and Harry. So yeah, that's why Rama Bhima Soma for the title.
बहुत शुक्रिया श्रीकर, राजीव गौड़ा और नेहा दीक्षित. इसके पहले कि आप जान जाएं कि किताब में सारा कुछ है, क्या है यहीं पर, और वीडियो यूट्यूब पर अपलोड कर दिया जाए और फिर किताब पढ़ने की आप ज़रूरत महसूस न करें। हम ये चाहेंगे कि आप किताब पढ़िए और उससे पता कीजिए कि किताब में क्या है। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आप तीनों का।